Alrighty, I guess the song is my cue. Thanks, Paget. All right, well, welcome everyone to our second Ladies Who Launch of the year. My name is Caitlin Bolaños, and I'm the Associate Director at the LU Idea Lab for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So for those of you that might be new to this series, Lilie is the home of entrepreneurship at Rice. And so we're trying to create more opportunities for our students as well as our alumni to pursue entrepreneurship. And so within our programming, we are trying to create more space for females in entrepreneurship and investing. And one of the ways we are doing this is through this Ladies Who Launch series, which is a dedicated hour once a month to learn from someone in our Rice community that has had like an interesting career, whether they're a founder or an investor or possibly even in corporate innovation, just to kind of give feedback on their career journey and some of the lessons that they've learned along the way, and so that the rest of us can just learn from them and all the wisdom that they've garnered. So this week we are so excited to host Monica Powell. Monica is nothing short of brilliant. I got to listen to her speak last week at a panel we co-hosted with the computer science department among some other entrepreneurs and investors, and I'm so excited to dive more into her specific story today. So thanks for joining us, Monica. Before I introduce her and hand it over to Monica, I wanted just to mention a few opportunities that we have coming up if you're a student or a Rice alumni. So one, we have a workshop series where we are helping students and alumni kind of go from idea to actually launching a venture. We have our second series in the workshop, and Paget, I'm kind of like throwing this on you, but if you could possibly just put the link in the chat. We have a workshop, and I encourage any female on this call that is like throwing around an idea, you have something you've been just, lingering on in your brain, come join us and just learn about some of the first things you can do to kind of like jump into that venture or test the idea out, and just take action and get started. And then we also are running a diversity, equity, and inclusion workshop on October 20th, and we have 50 limited spots for students and alumni, and we're bringing in a nationally renowned facilitator to host this workshop. We did it last year. It's nothing short of life-changing if you've never done a workshop like this, so we can also drop that into the chat for anyone that's interested. And then finally, for some of our students on the call, we have some other students that have banded together and they're launching a new student club called Women in Entrepreneurship. And as a follow-up to this, we'll send the recording as well as a link as to how to get involved in Women in Entrepreneurship. Now, this is a club that kind of feeds off of the community that's being built around Ladies Who Launch, but there's some more intentional mentoring and like networking opportunities built in, but it's a great resource if you are looking at exploring a career in startups, like launching your own company or working for an early stage company, or possibly even investing. So we'll be sure to share that information with you after this. But on to our special VIP guest, Monica. So as I mentioned, she is brilliant, fantastic, and she has a really exciting she has just like a really fascinating career to share with us. And she was actually one of the first, she was the first class of computer science graduates from Rice. So she was ahead of her time even back then. Since then, she's worked at Apple, she's done product design, she's been CMO, CEO, she's been on the board of advisors of many companies, and she's also been an investor. And so I am looking forward to hearing her share how she's gotten from Rice to where she is now. I'm sure she'll dive in, but she's had ups and downs along the way. On the panel, she just mentioned last week that she's been struggling with breast cancer, and so to throw that in the mix of everything that's going on in her life right now, I'm really looking forward to hearing how she's managed to do it all. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Monica just to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about this journey from Rice until now.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and to Lilie for inviting me to speak. It is truly an honor and a pleasure. I'm really passionate about supporting women, and particularly women who launch. So really thrilled to be here. Let's see. So I guess, Caitlin, you kind of wanted me to talk a little bit about my journey.
Yes, please.
And interesting that you mentioned that many women find themselves on a non-linear journey, right? They zigzag their way on the path. So I definitely fall into that zigzag pattern. I was actually born in India, but I grew up in Singapore. And then came to Rice as an undergrad, as an immigrant, as a student. And so I was just reflecting again. I remember growing up as a young girl in India and then in Singapore. And I remember being really upset that my brother got to do stuff and I didn't. And there was just something wrong. It just wasn't fair. So very early on, I kind of had gender inequity kind of in my face, if you will. And then in Singapore, there was, at the time, there were very few Indians in the community. It was primarily the local Malay or Chinese population. And so I was very conscious of racial inequality. And then certainly coming to Rice in engineering, typically being one of the only one or two women in classes, I was aware. I was always underdressing, always trying to kind of blend into the background, just always aware of being one of the few women in tech. And I think studies now show that actually the number of women in tech have reduced from that time. There was a little bit of a peak in the mid 80s, late 80s, and then it kind of actually went down, which is unfortunate. But the reason I mentioned this is because very early on, I had this thing that, that's not right. It's not fair. And I'm going to show them. So, and so, and also, in those days, I mean, to be honest, until quite recently, there was not this conversation. These conversations around diversity did not exist. You knew you were an only, you knew you were different, but you sucked it up and you just kind of got to it, right? You did what you could, the best you could. Interestingly, I was also reading a survey recently, and it said that I think right now there's about 26% women in STEM, right? About 20% in computer science. And in this study by Capital One, they said that 50% left after 3 years. And of the remaining 50% of women that stayed on track, about 73%, were always kind of reconsidering and questioning whether they wanted to stay. So, and I mentioned this because, as I was kind of reflecting on my zigzag, there were probably maybe 2 or 3 times that, I kind of tried to get away, if you will. So as Caitlin mentioned, I started off at Rice. I went through my computer science program, was, very lucky to work with Dr. Ken Kennedy on some of the very early beginnings of the internet. Did my master's in Madison, Wisconsin. Probably took one of the first classes in computer science and computer networking. And then also was very lucky to land a position in R&D at Apple. So the first beginning of my career was really being at Apple. It was, setting out from Madison, Wisconsin to Silicon Valley, being in R&D in these secret projects, if you will, as we were building stuff. I also got married. I had met my now husband back in high school. Parents were not approving, so that's why I was shipped to the US. We eloped and after we graduated from Madison, Wisconsin, and then came to Silicon Valley. And so the first few years was, just getting into engineering and kind of, proving yourself, uh, working at being an engineer, you know, getting your first house, having your first kid. I think having my first daughter, uh, for any woman, that's a huge shift, right? Because now all of a sudden, babies demand and deserve its 24/7 attention. And so that's one of the first times when that struggle to juggle begins. And so I was very lucky to have an extremely supportive partner. And so between my husband and I, we juggled. And I was also actually very fortunate to have family support. And so I had my parents help out. And so that's how I was able to kind of, keep things going. But during the time that I took off, because I did take a couple years off after my first daughter was born, I tried to do the part-time thing, but part-time doesn't work. You're working full-time, whether you like it or not. But I also then explored, went back to school and studied interior design. So that was my first zig, if you will. And I loved it. I loved Design 101. I loved history of furniture. I loved those classes. But pretty quickly on, I figured out that, okay, wait a minute, I love design, but I don't love selling. And so if I was to create a career, maybe that wasn't the right direction to go in. And around the same time, a good friend of mine from Apple had started his first company and invited me to join him. And so that's how I kind of made the shift from Apple and engineering to startup. And in a startup, you kind of do whatever needs to be done, right? It's like you're on a journey and you have limited resources. And so at this time, they needed help writing an architecture document, mapping out the technology. And then they needed help with the website. Then they needed help with marketing. And so all of a sudden, I found myself switching from engineering to marketing. But because I had the engineering background, that was critical to really understanding the product, understanding competitive analysis, and therefore then being able to do positioning and messaging, speaking to analysts, and helping get the word out. So that's kind of how the first shift happened from a big company, Apple, to startup land, and then out of engineering into marketing. I have to say that even when I was in engineering, I wasn't one of those people who was into speeds and feeds. I wouldn't sit there and look at, instructions or play with stuff just to play with stuff. It was always, what is this about? What is the benefit? What will the product deliver? So I was always interested in the benefits of the product. And I was also very, very interested in telling people about the product. So, I spent a little bit of time with developer relations, helping developers use the APIs I had written and so on. But anyways, what I found when I made the switch from engineering to marketing is actually that Design 101 class that I took in interior design was the best class I had. Because design, whether you're designing a room, whether you are designing, architecting a system, whether you are designing using words, graphics, right? Design is design. And so a lot of those fundamentals, really, I remember when I was at Rice, actually, I was like, in another lifetime, I would love to come back and do architecture. I was passionate about design, but if so, maybe another time. But anyways, so that was how the switch happened. And then that first startup was fantastic. It was, startups are intense, and entrepreneurial journey are not for the faint-hearted. It is a roller coaster in every sense of the way. You're always behind. You never have enough time, and you certainly never have enough resources. But it is a creative journey. And we built one of the first single sign-on products. The company went on to be acquired by Entrust, which was a leader in computer security. And I got to then run be part of the merger process and redesign the merged brands and the messaging around that. And and then my second daughter came along. And so then I took another break. So again, the nice thing of having support of my husband was that we always took turns. We went back and forth. So when I would take off, then he would double down. And if I, for example, when the acquisition and merger were happening, I was flying around and really busy. So he actually took some time off and stayed with the kids. So being able to do that was a huge blessing. One of the things I will mention is a lot of women, kind of don't want to step back sometimes because they're afraid they won't be able to get back into it. Believe me, 3 months is all it takes and you're back into the swing of things. So never, never worry about that. Anyways, so after my second daughter was born, I happened to, actually help found a company. This time it was in the voice over IP space. We had come across some technology, did a little acquisition, and then essentially tried to build that company up here in the US. It was one of the first software switches out there. So that was really interesting. But that then, at that point then, was when I actually was diagnosed with breast cancer for the first time. That was about 15 years ago. And in those days, cancer was not quite as well understood as it is now. And so I was dealing with a situation where, none of the tests showed anything, but every time they cut, they found something. So it was, and since I just founded the company and raised the first round, it was a pretty intense time where, okay, so what do? You have to, you have all this stuff that you're doing at work. And at the same time, you're dealing with a situation, and I had a 4-year-old at home. It was like, I was, losing my mind, to say the least. And that's when I actually remembered that when I was back in India, an aunt of mine had, said, meditation, that's the answer. And so since I couldn't hear myself, I was losing my mind, I was paralyzed. I started looking so that I could learn meditation. And as luck would have it, that truly, the experience of studying meditation, doing the practice, getting into mindfulness was a completely transformative experience. Because, Descartes said that, I think, therefore I am. Well, that's a lie. Okay. The mind, the brain is an organ. Its job is to think. We are not our thoughts. That organ does its thing. But there is actually, when you practice mindfulness, there is actually something that is listening. There is a consciousness that is aware of those thoughts. That ability to actually step aside and look at my mind, look at my thoughts, look at the worries, right? I was constantly worried. I always had a plan B for a plan B. I mean, when you start becoming aware of what's going on in your mind, when you start having to deal with the fear of death, right? So it forced me to go through that process and think about things that we never want to think about, right? Who spends time thinking about death, right? Who spends time looking at what you're afraid of, right? The first thing we want to do is not think about it. We don't want to talk about it. We just don't want to deal with it. We want to move on to something else, right? But because I had no choice but to consider and to confront these issues, that process actually allowed me to drop worrying, right? No longer be afraid of death. And once those types of changes happen, then what's going to happen? Let's go have fun. Let's do it. What is there? right? And so that was a huge transformative moment. And, dealt with the cancer, the treatments, whatever. And then again, went back into startups. I have to say that I was looking back on my journey, and every zig and zag, every startup that I went into, it was all because somebody called, picked up the phone and said, hey, check this out. Hey, would you like to do this? And, uh, no regrets, but I never went after companies or went after projects because of, because of what what brand they were or what have you. It was always because someone I knew, someone I liked, someone I respected invited me to play, and I wanted to play with those people. So my decisions were always based on which group of people I would be playing with. And then what game it was, what product it was, that was, in a startup, that is what you invent, right? So I never picked things, maybe unwisely, maybe picked things because of the ROI potential necessarily. It was all because, hey, there's a group of people, here's a project that looks interesting. Do I want to play with these people? Will this make the world a better place? Will this add value to the world? So anyway, so got back into doing more startups. And again, in each one of my startups, what I found was, because of the strong engineering background, again, you start from there. And I was able to say, okay, so what widget is this? What tech assets do we have? What can we make with them? Sometimes, founders will say, hey, I've done this, I've solved this problem. But the same asset, the same technology can actually be repurposed to solving a more valuable problem or a more obvious problem, and therefore create something of greater value. And so being able to figure that out, or sometimes you have competition, the competitive landscape makes it such that it doesn't make sense to go in a certain way, going after a certain direction. And then you have to lean a different way and do something different. But anyways, so I found myself going from cybersecurity into enterprise messaging to another cybersecurity company, a big data company, fast data company, and then into cyber intelligence. I was working with companies based out of Sri Lanka, companies sometimes out of India, out of Eastern Europe. And in this last company, I ended up having to do a merger of two companies in two different parts of Spain. And then figure out, okay, so how do I take this technology and how do I apply it to the US market? And then most recently, again, my cancer came back. And so then I went into quarantine 2 weeks before everybody else. So it was an enforced interruption. But by the same token, it was like, okay, been there, done that. And it was a great ride. And so most recently, I've joined an organization called How Women Lead, and a fund, How Women Invest. And I'm so thrilled to be able to take all that experience and all that background and say, okay, so, how can this help the next generation? Because I have to say that when I was going through it, there was no research. I didn't know that all these other women were going through the same things I was going through. I thought, it was me. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't whatever. It was always my fault, right? And now we know that women do that. They always underestimate their capabilities. And when something succeeds, somebody else made it happen. And if something fails, it's our fault. So, now after, in the last few months, when I've had a chance to read this research, this is when I'm understanding this. I didn't know it when I was in the trenches going through the process. So just really thrilled if I can help make the journey a little bit easier for those of you coming behind me. That would be great. One of the things I remember thinking in some board meeting or the other, it's like, this is ridiculous. Why the heck am I here? And I remember saying, well, you know what? I'm going to stand and I'm going to stay and I'm going to be, because you don't need to be this strong. We don't need to be this stubborn. Not all women will do that, and they shouldn't, right? But anyways, so that's kind of what has brought me here.
Thank you. Yeah, what a journey. When you're thinking back at all of the transitions that have happened in your careers and like all of the opportunities and all the phone calls you've gotten, does maybe like one particular incident or one particular transition stand out as one that you were quite nervous about? And if so, reflecting now, like what would you have told yourself in that moment, knowing what you know now? And maybe it's not an opportunity you said yes to, but maybe it's one you were afraid to say no to as well.
It's not about being nervous necessarily. I mean, in some sense, when you're in the startup world, when you're an entrepreneur, by definition, you're doing something new. By definition, you're doing something different. And so whether it's a product that's different, whether it's an industry that's different, whether it's a role that's different, a level of responsibility that's different, it's always challenging, right? And again, um, interestingly, now that I'm reflecting, what I realized was that, in some sense, companies are not set up to support women, right? There is no flexibility. We are not helping with childcare. We're not doing what needs to be done with elder care, because in the middle of all this, other than having my two girls, I also had a father-in-law with Alzheimer's that we were looking after at home, right? And women are the primary caretakers in all of this. And so in some sense, with the system is not flexible, and that is an issue that we have to deal with. I think there's a myth that you can have it all. Yes, you can have it all, just not at the same time, right? I couldn't have done this journey without such a supportive life partner. I could not have done this journey without my parents helping out when the kids were little. Um, Now I know, and I'm much more conscious about this whole systemic inequity and unconscious bias. I mean, you kind of knew you were dealing with stuff as you went through the journey, but as I said, you just dealt with it. But the research now is shown that men are supposed to be better at tech, and women in male jobs are thought to be less competent, and women who are competent are not liked. So you can't win either way. um, I believed in meritocracy. Now we know that that's a myth, right? um, so I guess in retrospect, we're too hard on ourselves. And so my advice would be just to kind of lighten up, give yourself a break. You're better than you think you are. And, if something doesn't work out, big deal. Now you know. If you knew better, you would have done better, right? So, and then I think the last thing that, as I was reflecting on the journey, was that because we are so committed to doing good and doing our best, and we're juggling, we spend all our time working. One of the things that I didn't do, and maybe I should have done more of, but I don't know how I could have, is build those relationships and those networks. um, um, you know, I think a lot of times everybody says network, 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 but the reality is, when you're putting in your time at work and you're juggling other things, it's hard to take the time to go for lunch. I mean, I don't, I was always working through lunch. but to stop yourself from doing that and making sure you are taking the time to build a few of those relationships and networks, I would say, is something I would have done differently. So anyways, I don't know if that answered your question, but that was just.
No, definitely, definitely you did. Yeah, I think that goes to biases, or I guess like inequity in the workplace. But yeah, typically females, like, we don't have the evenings or the lunch hours, the early mornings, because we're usually getting kids out the door or whatever it may be. So that is a hard aspect of this whole networking thing. So thank you for touching on that. You started to bring up implicit bias, and I know from an interview I've read that you have done some own work. You've done some work in your own life, like reflecting on your own implicit biases and trying to remedy those in your life. Can you share?
Sorry. Can you repeat that? I didn't catch.
I've read from an interview you did that you've done a lot of work to reflect on your own implicit bias and remedy some of those. Can you share a little bit more about kind of that reflection and that journey and some of the things you've done to remedy those in your life?
Yeah, I think by definition, when we talk about implicit bias, it's implicit, it's unconscious, right? So and that's why, again, being mindful, meaning being conscious, is so key. Because if you can't watch your mind, if you can't watch the assumptions and judgments that you're jumping to, you don't even have a chance to consider them and decide not to go with them, right? But and so by definition, implicit is unconscious. And so a lot of this bias that's happening is unconscious. And even for people who care about diversity, even for me, right, being at the other end in some sense of some of these issues, even I know that I have biases, right? Because we're human beings. This stuff is programmed. It's in the air. There is no way to avoid it in some sense, other than try to raise your own awareness, number one. And number two, try to create a systemic mechanism for dealing with it. So for example, there are some venture funds who made conscious decisions of not knowing the gender of the founders or the executive team as they were assessing an opportunity, right? So there are some things like that you could do, but if we knew better, we would do better, and we don't. So this is a tough problem. And therefore, what I say is, for us as individuals, we have to focus on raising our own consciousness. And for women who have to deal with gender inequity, you have to recognize, that this is how the world is. And then, make a conscious decision of, okay, so how are you going to deal with it? Right? So, and the way you deal with it is, one is making sure that you don't beat up on yourself, right? Sometimes when you see something that's not fair and it impacts you, yes, you can speak up and what have you. Many times it's so subtle that, you can't say anything. There is nothing to say, nothing logical to say, even though it's happening. But in those times, don't take it personally, right? Don't make it your fault. So I think, the more you can grow your own esteem, if you will, the better off you will be, number one. Number two, it's so important for women to support each other. Because oftentimes I'm like, that's ridiculous, that's crazy, how could that be happening? But if there's no one else to talk it through, and like, yeah, I'm not going crazy, I did see what I saw, right? Having a supportive group around you is also very helpful. So
I could ask you questions all day, and there's a lot to unpack here, but we've been getting more questions in the chat than we ever have. So I actually want to kind of turn it over to some of our, like, the guests, their questions, and make sure that they're answered, and then we can dive back more into the ones I had. But so for example, Zara, she asked that you mentioned that folks invited you to play in terms of kind of like some of those transitions, like you got invited and then that's what made you say yes, who you're playing with. But she's asking like, how does one get in the playground? So like, how do you start to get those invites to come join other people's
You know,
projects?
to be honest, it was always people I had worked with. You know, whoever I'd worked with Apple, that's who invited me to play at the first startup. And somebody who had worked with that startup went on to a different company, and they, you know, mentioned and brought me. So it was, even though I didn't spend the time or didn't have the luxury of networking um, uh, in my journey, it was simply people I had worked with every step of the way.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, kind of like your reputation and like
Yes.
itself.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and along that vein was, oh, when you were deciding whether to say yes or no to something, was there anything else that you ever considered instead, as opposed to just, you know, like who it was and people you would be associating yourself with? Was there any other kind of like parameters that you would use to guide your
You know,
decision?
well, obviously, you want to make sure that you're getting into a company that has potential, right? You have to be able to say, okay, so what is it that you have? You know, what can you do with it? What is the possibility there? What is the chance that something can happen of this? So yes, so I did my own little competitive analysis and assessment of the opportunity. But there were opportunities that I didn't um, continue with or go after when I, you know, thought that either a principal or people were not in sync with what I believed.
Very helpful, thank you. Awesome, and I think there's one more I wanted to get at before we go back. Oh, have you, from Christina, so talking about competent women that typically aren't liked. So have you seen competent women who were considered to be well liked, and what was it about them that people liked about them? Like, how did they approach their work that made them more likable? And then she asked, do we just need to wait until others catch up and start viewing women as people? So any feedback there?
So given that I have always been either the only woman or one of, you know, just a couple of women around the table. To be honest, I had no mentors, and there was no one that I could look up to or follow in that sense. But I think the answer is in the question, which is, you know, I said that, you know, one of the first things that we women do that's not a good thing is we never think we're good enough. The second thing that we do that is, you know, that we need to work on is we look for approval from the outside. We're constantly looking for approval, acknowledgement uh, from others. And rather than trusting ourselves and knowing that what we've done is good and good enough. Right? So I think if there's the second thing that I would say to people is really, you know, don't kid yourself, right? If you've messed up, you've messed up. But by the same token, stop looking for approval and appreciation or acknowledgement from the outside. Start learning to hear yourself, your own gut, and know when you've done a good job.
Basically, we don't necessarily need to be liked. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. And again, you know, people like people who are more similar to them, right? They're more comfortable with people who look like them, talk like them, think like them. And by definition, we're never going to be that way, right? We are different. And so, you know, don't chase after something that can't happen.
Yeah, sorry, that was a tricky question. I just found it to be very refreshing that you just said that out loud. Yeah, in terms of competence and likability and women. I mean, I think For me, so I've just done 3 years in consulting. So I've been seeing some generational changes in terms of like, so I see our women partners and they do tend to be a little bit more hardcore, but also the environment that they grew up in, they had to be a lot more cold and efficient because there was a stereotype that women were too emotional. And so that's where the likability and competency, they like diverged. But then like in younger generations now, I'm seeing more women who are competent and also considered to be, wow, I love this person. Wow, she's a great boss. So I was wondering if you had seen any of those trends and then, but
You know,
yeah,
I
no,
think
everything that you said, it makes sense.
the more you can be more comfortable in your own skin and know who you are, and uh, you know and therefore more confident you are, the more it will show and the more the response will be positive.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit, Monica, about kind of this latest project about women who invest, what you are doing and how you are helping other women? And then I'd like to like hear after you tell us more about this fund, if you could share any advice you have for us as to how we might not be able to personally invest in women-owned companies, but how can we create more space and how can we support other females in our life,
Sure.
and particularly like minority females.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. So I'm part of an organization called How Women Lead. That's about 13,000 women, senior executives in the Bay Area. And the organization really started by trying to get legislation through in California to get women on boards. And so today the organization does board training and board placement to get more women on boards. From this group, we created a venture fund called How Women Invest. And the idea here is that, so, you know, there are plenty of studies out there that basically show that women-led companies actually do better. They perform better, they return more on their investments and so on, than non-women-led companies. That's number one. Number two, 40% of companies are actually started led by women. Okay, so there's a huge number of companies that are founded by women. They perform better than women, and yet you've got only 2% of venture funds going to women. So there's something wrong there. Okay, only 11% of venture partners are women. And so when you have only a few women selecting and deciding to invest in funds, women founders don't have the network, so they don't connect to enough VCs. And then when they get in front of them in a pitch, when you don't have enough people at the other side of the table, you know, they don't get selected, they don't get funded, right? So what we did was we said, okay, wait a minute, we've got 13,000 people in this network here. 51% of personal assets worth $22 trillion is actually owned and controlled by women. So we said, let's start a venture fund. We capped it at $10 million because the SEC rules say that when you have a fund that's $10 million or less, you can have more limited partners, more investors. So you can have 249 investors in this fund. We kept the access low, so it's a minimum of $25,000 over 4 years to invest in the fund. So now all of a sudden, we can make venture investing more accessible to women, because otherwise, you know, you're putting $500,000 $1 million in a fund. So the idea is you've got women who've got money. Let's make it more accessible. We do angel training, you know, investment training, and then allow them to invest in the fund. So step one. Step two, we've got these great women entrepreneurs who are not getting funded. So let's find those wonderful companies to invest in. And so that's what we've been doing. And then the other thing is, because there's 13,000 women in this network, even before we announced the fund, we had a stream of startups looking for funding. It just so happens that more than half of those were women of color. 70% of the women who have invested in this fund are women of color. It's a $10 million fund. I think we've almost finished raising $9 million, so we have only $1 million left to go. And this all started during COVID. So the idea here is, number one, it's the network that lets us hear about deals. Number two, it's experts within the community that are helping with due diligence. Number three, it's investors who are women in the community who are investing, and we are making it, more accessible and easy for them to invest. And then once we invest in the company, so for the first company we invested in was Gray Matter Analytics, which is a woman of color out of Chicago. But once we invest in the company, then again, the network helps provide them with skill sets, with help at the board level, help with additional fundraising, etc. So it's like, let's not wait for the world to change. Let's go change the world ourselves. And so that's what we're doing. So the first fund is 10 million, almost, it will almost be fully invested in, or rather we will have finished raising that 10 million pretty soon. And then we'll do the next 10 million and the next and the next. So I'm really, really thrilled to be part of this network.
Amazing. Yes. There's another, Melanie just alluded to this as well. There's another MBA alum who's doing something similar, not as many LPs, but they're Houston based and they're investing in women-led companies.
Yes, there are quite a few gender lens investing funds, but I think what's different about this is the network that is allowing us to both hear about companies as well as due diligence during COVID when you can't go meet anyone, right? It's because somebody knows somebody and we can do that conversation via phone, via Zoom. And then, raising this money so quickly, again, because it's through the network, through people. And so really the importance of supporting other women is crucial. And so I think your last question was, so what can you do? Well, so choose who you work for, choose whose products you buy, right? Choose how you invest your time and money, and support. The credo for how women lead is to support each woman, to be there for them. Be fierce advocates for each other, say yes to helping each other, reinforce her voice, and be unabashedly visible. Those are the four items that are the credo of how women lead.
Fantastic. How do you have any advice for other white females as to how we can help our minority, like female colleagues, be heard and be supported?
I think women at their best are always looking out for the village, right? We do care and we do look after not only for ourselves and our families, but for the people around us. So it's not about, whether you're white or woman of color or what have you. I think somehow the culture has made it okay and good to simply be focused on yourself and, and it's all about win-lose. Well, that's not the reality, right? It is win-win. We don't win unless everyone else wins as well, right? So let's be committed to making sure that when you enter a room, look around. Instead of being worried about how you look and what people are going to think about you and what you're going to do, look around and, who else is there? Who's maybe not being included? Maybe who's, feeling a little, maybe they're junior, right? And therefore they're not drawn into the conversation. So simply be aware and be more compassionate about helping whoever's in the room.
Thank you. That's great advice. Going off of that, we did have a question about what challenges have you found, like specific challenges of fitting into a male-dominated like workplace or like a networking environment, and any advice on how to overcome those challenges. So do you have any like practical, besides, obviously like looking around the room and seeing other women and supporting them that way? any other very practical things that we can do as women in like male-dominated fields to be heard, to be seen, to get the support that we need?
I think if you pay attention to yourself, if you work on your own awareness, on your own consciousness, on understanding who you are, and therefore knowing why you're there in that room, then you will naturally start reaching out and getting to know people. They're just people, right? But and so I think one of the things that my pet peeve here is there are so many business books there and leadership books, and they have this checklist, do this and do that and do. Well, when you're in the middle of stuff, you don't go to your checklist and decide, okay, now how am I going to behave, right? Behavior comes from out of who you are and what you believe. And that's why I keep going back to, you have to be very clear on what your values are, what your objectives are, what your strengths are, and why you're doing what you're doing. Because if you're clear and you're comfortable in yourself, then you will naturally do the right thing in that room.
Did most of your confidence about who you are and your values and like your goals come in parallel with this practice of meditation, or were there things that you did previous to your kind of discovery of meditation and mindfulness that led you to like your own confidence in who you are, or did that come with you?
No, as women, society puts you down, right? I mean, there are so many messages that we get that we're not good enough, right? Or that's not our place. These messages are in the air. They're so unconscious. So for me, the mindfulness was step one, because then you can watch your own thoughts, let alone other people's, kind of behavior, right? And then, and in parallel with being able to witness and be conscious, you have to examine these assumptions. So educate yourself on these biases, on these assumptions that people make, cultures make, we make, right? Women so often are hardest on other women as well. So be conscious of, of your own expectations. And so for me, in many ways, I had to prove to myself that I was good enough, and stop expecting the acknowledgement from the outside, right? Because once you've done your work yourself and you know for yourself, then it really doesn't matter anymore.
You are full of wisdom. Well, I wanted to see if anyone had one last question. I know that we have some alums who have privately messaged me looking to invest in your fund if you're taking.
Absolutely. We would love to have any of you. It's 25,000 is the minimum. You can put in more, and it's over 4 years. So it's very, accessible. Yes, I would love to have folks from the RICE community participate, because this is just the first fund of many more funds that we will create.
Great.
We're going to change. And one of the other things that we're doing is we have training for angel investors as well, because we want the $22 trillion that women control. Unfortunately, women either don't invest or they don't invest in venture instruments. And that's also how your wealth gap starts becoming bigger, right? So it's really important for women to take responsibility, take charge, educate themselves, and have this as part of the mix in their portfolio.
Great. Well, we will spread the word on how to get involved in your fund. And then, thank you for sharing your insight over this last hour and spending this hour with us. Like, people clearly in the chat have really appreciated kind of like your transparency and your boldness. And it's been very refreshing. And we all, I think, needed to hear some of the things you were saying. How can we, as a group of like 30 participants, how can we be of support to you in this next endeavor in this fund? Anything practically we can help you with?
Go get them, guys. Be the best you can be.
Well, maybe you will eventually fund some of the students.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We love
And
that.
I'm available. I'm here, happy to chat, happy to support in any which way I can.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. I wanted to be conscious of the hour, so we'll let you get on to your next Zoom meetings. But appreciate you joining us, and we will announce the next Ladies Who Launch shortly, and we hope to see you all there. And in the meantime, for our undergraduate students, we'll get you plugged into the Women in Entrepreneurship Club.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.